And that was probably the most helpless I've ever felt in my life.
Wow.
Not being able to save my friend and not knowing what to do, to now building a medical trauma plan and oftentimes being the sole medical provider for the First Lady and the Vice President.
What was your first day like at the White House?
A lot of times in my career, people have sowed seeds for trees that are going to provide shade that they'll never benefit from. The weight of that responsibility was not lost on me. Remind yourself that you're not the exception, you're exceptional.
Welcome to Civvies, where we bridge military experience and civilian triumph. I'm Stephanie Holman, this season's new host and a former Army Medical Service Corps reservist turned technical recruiter. Over the years, I've tackled a variety of terrains from the highest of highs to the lowest of lows. Join me as we gather stories and explore the intersection of military expertise and civilian opportunities, providing valuable insights for a seamless journey beyond the uniform. Welcome to Civvies, a podcast by MetroStar.
Welcome to MetroStar's Civvies Podcast, where we're making it our mission to make your military transition just a little bit better by sharing the stories of others that have gone before you. My guest today is Dr. Bernard Toney Jr. Bernard is a combat veteran with 21 years of service. Did I get that right?
21 years, yes.
21 years. Incredible. A Tillman Scholar, former White House medical officer that provided medical planning for the President, First Lady, and Vice President, serving two administrations, caring for some of the most powerful people in the world. I should also mention that Bernard is well known on LinkedIn and covers many topics that thousands, including myself, can relate to, which includes rising above failure, grit and determination, and the impact of mentorship. Welcome to MetroStar's Civvies, Bernard. I am absolutely honored to have you here. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you so much. And that introduction was by far the best introduction I've ever heard of myself in all the years that I've been doing things like this. So.
Well, thank you. I have to say, if I were on a panel and I were a speaker, I would never want to go after you. You've got such an incredible story. I don't know how, anyone follows you right after that, but definitely appreciate you being here and open to, sharing more about your story. There's a lot of valuable parts of your story that I think folks can relate to, and take a little bit from to move themselves forward. On a personal note, something I wanted to share. I was raised by a school guidance counselor. My dad came out of a pretty rough situation and dedicated his life to early intervention, especially for middle schoolers. He thought that was the point where you could catch someone young and really make an impact. If he were alive today, man, oh man, would I love to call him and tell him about you. I think he would find your story just extraordinary. You've broken barriers for yourself, for others. And like I said, there's just so much there that I want to dive into. I want to go way back here before we get to this picture. We talk about this young man here, and start with, academics. I think as a doctor, someone meeting you today that might not know your story, right? They might have they might have an idea of where you came from or what your life looked like, and that might be very different from what your story actually is. What kind of school did you go to? What did that look like for you?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I grew up in Atlanta, Georgia, the metro area of Atlanta, Georgia, in a city called Decatur. And during that time, Decatur was really divided. There was, sort of like a line of demarcation where Black people lived and white people lived. My side of that line of demarcation was largely socioeconomically deprived, disadvantaged. And the school that I went to, without naming the school, was probably one of the worst schools in the state of Georgia, not just Atlanta, Georgia. So I started that way in elementary. If you can imagine that same population of students will naturally progress to middle schools and high schools that are of the same demographic with the same challenges. So, I just didn't go to the best schools, and I wasn't the best student during my early years.
Gotcha. And we're going to dive into that a little bit more. I do want to mention this photo of you that has kind of gone viral a little bit on social media. One thing I wanted to mention is, for me, you embody discipline and doing hard things over a long period of time. There was a quote when I was reading your story that I kept coming back to, actually by Kobe Bryant. You may have heard this quote, but I thought, man, that really kind of fits part of your journey. And I'm going to read it because I want to get it right. It says, Kobe says, at the end of every day, you have to look yourself in the mirror and ask yourself, did I get better today? And if the answer is yes, and you do that for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, how much better are you going to be? It's the small steps. You don't try to get it all done in one day, 1 week, 1 year. It's the process of getting better every day and doing that for a period of years that then create the masterpiece. So when I look at this photo of you, the before, right, and the after, I think of all those steps in between these two photos, maybe 50,000, 100,000, however many steps between these that took you all over the world and changed you.
Right.
And I can't wait to talk about that. I also think of this young man over here, and I'm like, wait. How did you get into the military with gold teeth?
That's a good question.
Right? I joined the Army during my J-Lo era. So I had blonde hair, and the recruiter said, absolutely not, right? When you go to boot camp, no, we're going to change this, right? So yeah, very, very interested to hear more about that. Tell me, when you were growing up, you went to, I believe it's an M2M program. What was that?
Yeah, great question. So I joined, it was the Minority to Majority program. I think they've since discontinued that program in Georgia. But essentially what it was is they tried to integrate schools because, as I mentioned earlier, that line of demarcation meant that, students in minority areas did not have the same opportunities as students in majority areas. And so they started a busing program. And I was chosen to partake in that. I went to a school much better as far as academics than my home school. And I did that for about 6 months before I was immediately placed back into my home school.
Okay. Yeah. So were you identified as kind of gifted in order to attend that program?
Right. So standardized testing at that time. So I was able to qualify for a magnet school, and my test scores on standardized tests were very, very high comparatively to the rest of the student population. So I think that was part of it. And then the other part of it was really just, identifying the students who would thrive in that type of environment, which turned out not to be the case for me, but that was the idea kind of going in. And
was this school, I guess, in your immediate neighborhood? Is this somewhere you were bused to? That was a considerable.
It was a long commute. I think it had to be at least about 40 minutes on a school bus, which meant that when everyone else that would go to that school, they would organically have their friends to play with after school, but I had to get back on my bus and go back to my Black neighborhood.
Gotcha. So not many connections with that community.
Not at all.
That you were dropped into.
Not at all.
What kind of impact did that make with your success or failure with that program?
I think it was the start of me feeling like I was lesser than comparatively. So when I first walked into that class, I remember I was the only Black face, and maybe everyone was turning around to look at the new student, but I felt as though everyone was turning around to look at the Black student. And so for me, it was very difficult because I didn't know many of them. They had all gone to, this is in middle school, they had all gone to maybe the same elementary schools. They had their organic relationships and friendships. I was, to your point, dropped into that environment. So I felt inferior from that perspective. And I really focused more so on the way I looked as opposed to my abilities. And it turned out to be to my demise within about a half of a year.
Wow. Okay. So you go back to your community, and then what happens?
I go back to my normal pathway and trajectory of what everyone else did before I left. I had only been out of my home school district for, again, about 3 or 4 months, like half of the school year, before they told me that I wasn't meeting the marks to be able to perform in that school, and I went back to my home school.
And were you relieved when you went back? Were you like, yes,
I was.
It is what you wanted?
It's very interesting that you might think that a school that performs so poorly, one would naturally want to go to a school that does well, but there's a certain level of discomfort when you don't identify with the student population, when you're so different. That's the only thing that you can focus on at that young of an age. I think that was the case.
So you make it through high school, and unfortunately, there's a pretty tragic event that occurs right before you joined the Army. Can you tell us a little bit more about what that event was and how that kind of impacted your journey? So
I decided to join the Army in my junior year of high school. It was a delayed entry program. And so I had already committed myself to joining the Army. I wasn't doing exceptionally well in high school either. So I ended up going to an alternative school called Open Campus. And the student population there was largely maybe guys that were involved in the justice system, the criminal justice system, maybe younger girls who got pregnant. And they lost a lot of time in the traditional school setting. And so they were able to go to this sort of alternative school to make up that time. And so I went to that school for my senior year, and I graduated early. So that way I would be leaving high school in March to join the Army in April.
And did your parents, at this time, you're not 18, obviously. Did your parents have to sign?
They did.
They signed, okay.
Yeah, they did. So at that time, they'd signed, I believe I was 16 and a half or something. And my father said, you'll be a man if you go to the Army. And so I believed him. But about 3 weeks, March, I can't remember the exact date, but March of 1999, I was celebrating my upcoming send off to the Army, and my friend, Ivan Gray, his graduation. For many people, it doesn't sound like a big deal, but where I grew up, to graduate high school was a big deal. And so Ivan was my friend, and we were celebrating his assured graduation from high school in that June, and I was going to the Army and graduating as well. And we went to a popular nightclub that teenagers went to or frequented. And after we were leaving the club, I was going to the gas station to get gas. As soon as I parked my car at the gas station, shots rang out. And so I started to hear bullets pierce my vehicle. And I had 2 other friends with me, so it was a total of 4 of us in a car. And I sort of just kind of ducked down and started driving out of the area. And as I'm driving away, my gear shift was in the middle of the car. And so my friend, he's convulsing, and I think he's actually joking at the time.
So you didn't realize?
I didn't realize that my car had been shot up as many times as it had been, and I didn't realize that he had been shot. And so he leans over.
Yeah.
He leans over, and blood starts to pool.
I'd heard your story before, and it's one of got these Kleenex here. It's one of those stories where you know where it's going and how it's going to end, and you don't want to turn the page. That's when I first heard it. I was like, no, right. Don't end this way, right? Yeah. Just tragic.
It was tragic. So he leans over, blood pools all over my hand. I drive about a half a mile down the road on Memorial Drive in I believe it's still Decatur, Georgia. And I pull him out of the car, and all of my friends were around me saying, "Don't let him go to sleep."
And you're 17, you don't have the tools, the resources, the medical training that you do now.
Right.
To
even looking back, I don't think that there was anything that I can do. And pardon me for that, but I don't think there was anything I can do. Friends are saying, don't let him go to sleep. He takes his last breath, and that was that. And that was probably the most helpless I've ever felt in my life. Because I didn't know exactly what to do. So as I called 911, they said, "Where is he shot? Where are you?" I'm trying to figure all this stuff out in the middle of the night, maybe 1 or 2 a.m. And I'm not able to process this information. So for a while, I had this survivor's guilt. That was there something that I was able to do? Could I have called 911 faster? Right. Should I have taken him out of the area where he was shot? All these things were kind of haunting me for many, many years.
Yeah, understandably so. It's a really heavy, tragic event that, having not been through, I can't even imagine that, right? Or go there.
So then I joined the Army 3 weeks later.
And 3 weeks later,
I'm in boot camp.
You're in boot camp.
Yeah.
Does anyone at that time, did your recruiter know that you had just gone through the loss of your friend? Did anyone at boot camp know?
No. Well, my recruiter did know, Terry Daniels, and we're still friends to this day. He did know, but the idea is that, this is where you die or go to jail. So it's better to just leave as soon as you possibly can. And so 3.5 weeks later, I was in boot camp. And while everyone was focusing on drill and ceremony and the basics of learning how to be a soldier, I was still trying to process the death of my friend.
I think for those that don't, or maybe don't know your full story, but know a little bit, they maybe think that, you joined the Army and off you went and life was gravy after that. You got all the resources you needed. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, the Army didn't want me. I think that's the best way to describe it. I looked like that. I had 12 gold teeth. My first job in the Army was to be a Russian linguist. And so I did fairly well on the ASVAB. So they said you can go into military intelligence. And I went to Monterey, California to learn Russian. But every time I opened my mouth, everyone would look at me and say, "What happened to you?"
Right,
so I had people ask me, "Did you get into a really bad car accident?" People started relating me to this figure, I think on 007 called Jaws.
Oh no! I thought you were going there. I was like, "No, yeah."
I had never watched 007 or anything, so I had no idea what they were talking about. But nonetheless, it became. I was a spectacle. I was someone that people will point at and say, "Ooh, look at him. He's so weird."
Right.
And so I didn't do well because my job was to speak, but I didn't want to open my mouth because of the jarring response that it would garner. So I failed my first language, which was Russian, shortly after. Then I went to another training site to learn how to be a combat medic. And they sent me to mental health tech school. And at that point, the Army was very clear that they didn't want me because my first sergeant, maybe all your listeners know what a first sergeant is, but essentially it's a leader within an Army unit. She said, you're not consistent with Army standards. And so they sent me to a dentist.
Right.
And the dentist, I remember he had his back to me and he says, "Well, I can't remember the numbers of the teeth, but he said, it looks like on your chart you have gold crowns from tooth number 12, 13, 14. He said, "That can't be right." And then he turns around and he looks at me and there was no white to be found in my smile. And so he wrote me a letter, a profile, like a doctor's note that basically says that my dental aesthetics as they present were not against Army regulation.
Okay.
But I had to carry that around with me for anyone who might ask.
Oh, wow.
So they pressured me, and the pressure campaign was really to try to push me to a point of where I would just say, I want to leave the Army. And they almost got me there. They would ask me, what gang am I from? And what hood did I grow up in? And all the things that I tried to shed. But I couldn't escape it. And what compounded that was I had to go back to Atlanta, Georgia to testify for the murder trial. When I did that, it cemented every preconceived notion that everyone had about me.
Right, because it sounds like they didn't know you were a victim.
Right.
Okay.
But the circumstances of murder, you know, sounds as though, you know, maybe you were involved. And so I went back to testify. These kids were 17 years old. I believe they both got life plus 20. And I came back to my training site, which was Fort Sam Houston, Texas. And I was pushed basically to try to put me out of the Army. And I had a guy named Gary Berkeley who saw the risk that had I gone back to Atlanta, Georgia, that I probably wouldn't be alive today. And so he would take me under his wing in a drill sergeant kind of way. He would call me over and say, get down on the ground and do push-ups. And while I'm doing push-ups, he would like whisper in my ear, don't let them take this from you. You don't want to go back. Don't let them rob you of your future.
What did you ever find out? Did you meet Gary later in life and find out what was his story? What was behind him pausing, right? Because he saw something in you and affirmed you in that moment, like, no, you should be here.
You know, that's a good question. I never got to those depths with him. I just know that for some reason, God put him in my path and he protected me during that time.
So it sounds like there were a lot of incorrect perceptions that were going on there that others had about you. I always say perception's not reality, right?
Right.
How did you silence that noise and get through that period? I think that would be really, especially when we're talking about, you know, gold teeth, something very visible that stands out, and you have folks around you that are pointing this out. You know, you've got this note in your pocket explaining it's not against Army regs. Right. Probably is now.
Right. Maybe. I don't know.
Maybe. Yeah. But how did you deal with that?
I didn't deal with it well. I internalized a lot of it because it was so evident in all of my leadership that it made them uncomfortable, you know? And so them being uncomfortable made me uncomfortable. And I was, fast forward, I was going through my mental health tech training, and I opened my mouth, and it was, again, this jarring experience that this guy is going to be counseling people, and he looks like this. And I had a woman named Sergeant Fancher. She said, you know, you may survive in a drug and alcohol setting or something like that where people can identify with, you know, your aesthetics as they present. But you really should think about, you know, removing the gold teeth. And so I took her up on that. And I met people like maybe your husband who looked at this as a project. So I met a dental surgeon, I met a periodontist, orthodontist. It was a hard road to recovery. I had an open bite, so food would fall out of my mouth because I couldn't keep it in. Oh, you know, it was a grotesque sort of thing for a while. And once I was able to shed myself of that, now I was able to convince people to look at me as a human, because for a while I felt like an animal. Wow.
What was behind, you know, the gold teeth? I think back to my early 2000s. I wore lots of very baggy clothes, right? Didn't look good. We're not going to show pictures of that. Right. But I think back to that time, and I think it was a way to protect myself. Yeah. I, you know, was insecure. I didn't want people to like know me or see me. Right. So I didn't know what I was doing at the time. I know now, right? As I was putting on these layers. So you physically couldn't get to me, or I was sending that message of like, no, don't talk to me. Right.
I think there's two elements of it. One is it's a cultural phenomenon to live in the South during that time. It wasn't uncommon for many people, even grandmas and older people, to have gold teeth. So just kind of growing up in a largely Black community in the South, that was not uncommon. Okay. But to your point, I'm a smaller guy, so I was kind of bullied when I was growing up. And this was a way for me to look visibly vicious. So I had gold chains, I had gold teeth. I looked the part of being a thug. And so that was sort of protective, I think, when I look back in retrospect.
You're known for saying these three things that I think are really, really powerful, and I want to share with our audience. Availability, accessibility, and representation can change your life. So we just heard about the sergeant Gary Berkeley, that would whisper in your ear, right? And say, no, you should be here. At what point in your maybe early or mid years in the Army did you feel like, yes, I should be here?
Ooh, I think that was really late in my career. Because, although I had a lot of success early on, I was at E6 by the time I was maybe 22 or 23.
Wow. Yeah.
I became an officer soon after. I just, I did not have a whole lot of confidence, even with being a high performer. I went through ROTC. I was a distinguished military graduate, top 10% of the country. But even with all of those accolades, I think probably because of my formative years, I always felt like I don't belong here. So the imposter syndrome had always been there.
And, it's really interesting to hear you're so accomplished, right? That you've experienced that imposter syndrome. Again, someone meeting you today, not knowing your story,
right,
would probably think you've never felt like an imposter. You walked in, owned the room, you know exactly what you're doing, where you're going. I really appreciate you sharing that. For our military veterans, I want to talk about like challenging stereotypes or biases.
So for me, I'm a Christian. So it took for me to be able to say, I know who I am and whose I am. So that came later on in life. But once I realized that God made me in his image, exactly the way he wanted to, that was affirming for me that no one was able to take away from me. But it took quite some time for me to get there because for so many years, the objectivity of it all was the way I look. And then it was, you're the black guy in the room. So once someone really looks into themselves and say, I know the value of who I am and no one can take that away from me. That's when the stereotypes and the preconceived notions and the ideas of who you are just based on your phenotypical appearance, the way that you look, those concepts don't mean anything. I wish I had learned that earlier in my life and earlier in my career, because I was operating out of a sense of scarcity, a sense of lack of confidence and things of that nature. But the earlier that one could figure that out and know that you're valuable, you're unique, there's only one of you in this world, the earlier that a person can figure that out, the better.
I want to talk about more people that poured into you. Tell me about Clyde Hill and what he represented to you.
Clyde Hill is, I believe he's retired now. He was, when I was a young soldier at Fort Sam Houston, Texas, he was the first black officer that I had ever seen. And in those days, it just wasn't that common. And he was my company commander. And he walked out. He's a nurse by training, but he was the company commander for my company. And I remember him walking out. And this is back in the day when the rank was shiny. It was like not subdued. It was like, and I remember seeing those shiny captain's bars and seeing it on a black person. And I remember thinking, it's possible.
Right.
Because before that point, I'm 3 years in the Army maybe, and I have never seen a black officer. So that was the first black officer that I saw. And when
are we talking first black officer you saw in person, or even on there's usually the wall, right?
Yeah.
You've got your commander and
all of the above.
Oh, okay.
All of the above. I had never seen a black person on the command leadership wall. I had never seen a black officer anywhere that I had been. And at that point, I had already been at the Defense Languages Institute in Monterey, California, had also been at my basic training site, and now I'm in Texas. So across 3 states for me, I had not seen a black officer, and that was the first image of success that's still ingrained in my memory. He signed my orders for me to go to airborne school. He sent me off to be a paratrooper, and I went and did those types of things. Mm-hmm. But fast forward many years, I'm sitting in a sauna, and I look up, half naked, and I know you, yeah. I see Clyde Hill, and he's a colonel, and wow. And that was just amazing. And ironically, we went to the same church in Hawaii.
He represented, like you said, that it was possibility
that didn't otherwise exist for me at that point.
And what a cool full circle moment. Even in a sauna. Yeah. And then go into the same church. Another person on my list. I'm telling you, if I could have, if I have like 5 people I've written down I want to ask you about. And I'm like, man, I need to find a Gary Berkeley, a Clyde Hill. Tell me about Sergeant Jason Durr.
Sergeant Durr. He was not African-American. He was a white guy. Mm-hmm. And when I arrived to Fort Benning, Georgia, he said, listen, I'm your sergeant and you're going to go to college. And I said, I am not smart enough to go to college and you can't make me. He said, oh, yes, I can. And so he took me down to the to the education center. He signed me up for college classes. And I failed that first college class. The first ever college class that I took.
Well, we got to know the class. What class? Do you remember what class it was?
Western Civilization at some random university.
Okay.
And so I failed. And I said, see, I told you I couldn't do this. I told you I'm not smart enough. And he said, you're going to go back and you're going to re-enroll for another class. And anyway, I passed that second class and he was leaving the Army. And he said, I want you to finish and get your degree. He was leaving the Army to go to social work school. He wanted to be a social worker. And so what was remarkable in Jason Durr was just as he made me take that first step, and I wouldn't have otherwise. Mm-hmm. I'm pretty confident that I wouldn't have. He was that impetus for pushing me to move further academically. When I was an executive officer at Baumholder Army Clinic in Germany, I was going through a stack of resumes, and I was looking to hire a social worker for our organization. And I went through all these resumes. I shortlisted the candidates, and I run across Jason Durr.
So were you like, wait a minute? Did you think it was him?
I didn't. I had a feeling, but once I went through the skills, knowledge, and attributes and experience, and I landed on him when I was calling him to do a virtual interview and make my final selection. I said, would you happen to be Jason Durr that was stationed at Fort Benning, Georgia, in this year?
Right.
And he said, yes. And I said, were you assigned to this unit? He said, yes. And I said, I'm your private. I was your soldier. And I was able to see him when he came to Germany before I departed Germany to go to Texas, and that was just remarkable.
Another full circle moment. And then he goes on, right, to become a social worker.
He goes on to become a social worker. I believe he's still working for the government in some capacity. But just the impact, that he was able to push me to make that first step, that first step of a million steps in my journey. Mm-hmm. I was able to unknowingly give him an opportunity for him and his family.
Right. And I'd love to bring him in too, get another chair. So obviously you take this class. I'm going to assume you don't know what kind of degree you want to go after or what you want to do. How do you get from that to going to PA school?
Well, then I realized that I remember Clyde Hill and I want to become an officer. Mm-hmm. And passing that second class put me on fire. And I started taking classes in the most unorthodox of settings, on mountaintops in Afghanistan, bordering Pakistan. When everyone else we would go, to shooting schools, and I would be, I would study at night. I knew I had significant deficits, and I worked tirelessly to fill those voids. And I was unstoppable from an academic standpoint at that time. And so I started focusing on what I need to do to go to ROTC. I was not selected for active duty ROTC, which meant that I was going to leave the Army as a staff sergeant, getting language pay and jump pay, and basically be, I was poor for two and a half years while finishing the remainder of my degree requirements. My commander actually told me, no, I'm not going to sign this paperwork for you to go out there and fail. You're going to go out there. You're not going to have a job. You're going to need money. And all of those things were true. But I went to ROTC. I did exceptionally well. I had a professor of military science who saw at every point that I wanted to quit. He just would not let me. He took a personal investment in me. And his name was Colonel McFarland, and we retired the same month, same year from the Army. And
wow.
And then I become an officer, and the rest is history. And at that point, I just keep going and keep going and keep going.
Tell me a little bit about your PA career and what you loved about it. How many years did you work in that capacity?
The way that I went into PA school was very interesting. I didn't have any of the requirements. I didn't have an SAT. I didn't have anatomy and physiology. I didn't have chemistry or biochemistry or organic chemistry. So when I sent in my packet, my application, if you will, it was empty. It was all of these IOUs, memorandums that said, I'll get this done by this date. I'll get this done by that date.
Right. Yeah.
And I didn't even have a professional photo. You need to have a Department of the Army photo at the time. And I took a photo of myself in Afghanistan. I had my administrative S1 folks stamp off on it to say it was really me. And I sent in this empty packet. And they said, you need shadowing hours. I shadowed a previous Special Forces medic in Afghanistan, and my shadowing hours were taking care of wounded enemy combatants. It was interesting to learn basic medicine by taking care of people who otherwise want to kill you. And so that was very unique. But I went to school. The first test, I failed. And I failed massively. Biochemistry. And so out of 3 tests, you need to maintain an 80%. I think I scored a 64% or so that first test, which meant that I needed to ace the next 2 tests in order just to survive.
Right.
But I had people who saw me and they said, listen, you look like you're struggling. Let's get you there. And so they supported me. And from that point, I've had a great military career. I've been in an executive medicine capacity. I worked with soldiers. My first clinical job was in family medicine in South Korea, which is where I met my wife. And I did a number of other things. I went to flight surgeon school. I did a lot of, pretty impactful things in the Army. And the capstone assignment for me was to work at the White House Medical Unit.
So you got to take us there. How in the world? I mean, is there an application process for the White House? Do you get tapped on the shoulder? Are you jumping on Indeed? I know it's not on Indeed. What?
Yeah. So there is a lot of times in my career, people have sowed seeds for trees that are going to provide shade that they'll never benefit from.
Right.
And Stuart Miller was a previous White House medical officer. And when I was going through training, he mentioned that. And I kept that, I logged that in the back of my mind. I said, wow, if I ever get the opportunity. So when I was in South Korea, there was an announcement for applying for the White House. You have 48 hours. And you had this entire insurmountable list of things to do. And I stayed up for 48 hours.
Wow.
Doing all of the security things, and I submitted an application. I was shortlisted, and then I was invited out to Washington, D.C. to interview. The interview was, without going into a lot of details, pretty elongated,
right?
Over several days, and then after you've gone through those iterations of evaluation, you're then vetted for security to make sure that you're a person that can be within arm's reach of the president at any time. And so as I got back on the plane, I landed back in South Korea, and a day later they said, pack up your things and you're coming back to Washington, D.C.
I have to ask, I mean, do you mute the phone and, scream in the background and throw fist bumps and then get on and accept it, or, I mean, I just think.
Well, at that point, I told myself, if I don't make it there, I'll still be fine.
Okay.
And so once I got that phone call, I was prepared to hear no. But they don't call in that way to tell you no.
Right.
And so I was ecstatic. I still didn't feel like I was the right candidate because why me? And that's been the, sort of this trend in my career where I've had this grace sort of extended to me. And yeah, at that point, it was still why me? Like, I remember the other people who interviewed. They were stellar candidates, amazingly brilliant healthcare professionals and tacticians on the battlefield and everything else, but they saw something in me.
So would you say that you were still feeling a little bit of like imposter syndrome?
Absolutely. 100%. The White House made moves and they sent me to the Command and General Staff College en route, which, kind of bumped me in front of everyone else, for lack of better words, who would have otherwise been going. And, I'm doing all of these things, but I'm not confident that I'll be successful. It was quite intimidating. But, I think that God puts you where he wants you.
Right.
And I did exceptionally well.
Without, saying too much, because I know you probably can't give too many details, but what was your first day like at the White House?
It's almost, it's almost magical. I can't really explain just how significant it was to be able to walk in a business suit and have the charge in very short order to be one, if not the only person to save the president, vice president, or the first lady. And so the weight of that responsibility was not lost on me, but I just felt enormously blessed.
I'm thinking back to when you were 17, early tragedy, losing your friend, not knowing what to do, and here you are now.
The irony of it all, right? Not being able to save my friend and not knowing what to do, to now building a medical trauma plan, a contingency plan, and oftentimes being the sole medical provider for the first lady and the vice president. The irony of that. But again, I think that all of those experiences, whether it had been when I was 17 years old or in Afghanistan for the 3 tours that I served, they were all critical developmental phases of my life to be able to do just that.
Just incredible. I know I keep pausing here, but I'm just taking it, I'm taking it in. Obviously, I've not worked at the White House. I feel like this is probably a reason I probably will never work at the White House. I would want to ring a bell down in Town Square, like me over here. It's me. I'm going to the White House tomorrow. I imagine you did not do that.
There's discretion in everything that we do.
Yeah. So I would imagine that you travel probably a lot with that position. Can you tell us a little bit about kind of what that looked like? And
yeah. So, we had a principal, and the principal would be either the president, the vice president, or the first lady. And so we traveled everywhere with them, no matter where they went. So a lot of overseas travel. If you look at my timeline, I was at the White House over the presidential election year. So that was a lot of traveling to many different places. It was also a year of COVID when the pandemic started. It was also a year of racial unrest. So there was some amazing travel in which I went to places like Biarritz, France, or Paris or Belgium and things like that to support the principal. But there was also times when I went to like Kenosha, Wisconsin after, the city was largely burned down during riots. And there were, it was difficult for me to be able to work in that capacity, to see how divided our country was. And so many of the trips were great, but many of them were very, very, very difficult.
What was your balance, work-life balance, if you will, during that time?
I didn't have any.
Okay.
So I didn't own my schedule. And if the boss, whoever the boss is of the day, if they wanted to go somewhere or do something, that's what I was doing. And so it was a lot of going on a mission, planning for the next mission, going on a mission, planning for the next mission. And so for my time, particularly during an election year, my family didn't see me quite often.
Okay.
And even when I was in Washington, D.C., I didn't sleep in my own bed.
Wow. And when you say family, you're talking your wife, and you have young kids at this time.
Correct.
As well. Okay.
Yeah.
So I would imagine you missed some important events.
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
My daughter, I remember her once saying that she was learning piano. She had a piano recital, and she said, I didn't invite you to my recital because I knew you were going to be with the vice president.
Oh, man. I hope it's a story she can laugh about, right?
We'll
in the future.
Yeah.
Certainly important, right? To be with the vice president. So where do you go after being at the White House? Talk to me about what happened next.
Yeah. So my life has been interesting after I've retired. My initial idea is that I wanted to go work for the State Department because when I was traveling with the president and vice president overseas, I would interface with the State Department medical providers to help build out my medical plan. And I kept thinking, wow, this is an amazing job. And I wanted to do it right away, but my wife wasn't on board.
Okay.
And she told me no. I did find certain people very impactful. One was Dr. Anthony Fauci, and I knew that he was at the NIH. And so I interviewed and I started working at the NIH, doing research in vascular medicine and translational vascular medicine, where we studied known diseases, but also disease discovery. And I was doing that work for about a year and a half. I finished my MPH during that time. I found this newfound passion of public health. And then I transitioned from there to Department of Homeland Security for a brief stint as their public health and medical planner for the Southwest border. And now I'm at the VA at the moment for the next 10 days, working remotely, doing telemedicine, telehealth for our veterans.
Gotcha. Okay.
And I've, this is news, but now my wife has finally said yes.
Okay.
The State Department has extended the offer, and I'll be starting my foreign service training on April 8th. And I'll be at a U.S. embassy overseas this summer. Congratulations. Thank you.
Yeah, you are definitely someone we're going to keep an eye on. Something I want to go back to is your military transition. So you've got just so much experience with transitioning during different chapters of your life, right? And surviving those chapters and going on to bigger and better. How would you describe your own military transition? Were you nervous about that transition? Did you kind of, even with being prepared, did you not know what was going to happen next? Like, what did that look like for you? Someone that I think most would perceive to have a good handle on things.
Yeah, that's a great question. Nervous, absolutely, because irrespective of all the cool things that I've had the opportunity to do in the military, it was very structured. I didn't necessarily have to define opportunities. They were well defined and delineated, and they were advertised. You knew where to go find them.
Okay.
Once I was making the transition to the private sector, or to the civilian sector, it was a sea of opportunities. And I couldn't blame the Army at that point. It was, if I looked at my wife and said, listen, we're stuck at, Fort Hood, I can blame the Army, right? But now these decisions are like semi-permanent, and I've made them. And so that was daunting for me.
Okay.
And the thing that I really wanted to do, I didn't have the buy-in from my wife to be able to do it at that time. So I was a bit nervous and I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do. But I knew that wherever I landed, I was going to thrive. My philosophy is, just grow where you're planted. And so the jobs that I've had up to this point, I've done exceptionally well. And, I think that they will say the same thing in the organizations that I've worked for. But it was nerve-wracking. It was a lot of indecisiveness about where to live, my wife is South Korean. So do I live in a Korean community? And that's ultimately what I chose to do. I live in Ellicott City, Maryland, and we'll soon be moving from there. But I chose to live in a place where my wife would feel most comfortable.
Okay.
Where my children would feel very comfortable as Korean is their first language. And I gave them that opportunity while still working on other things. So to answer your question, really that phase of my life was whatever my family needs, I'm going to provide that.
Right.
And I took a backseat because they gave so much in the way of sacrifice for me to be able to do the things that I did.
I was going to say, yeah, because you definitely have to prioritize a little bit differently. I know that as a military spouse, I'm still feeling that. But ultimately, I'll probably get my first choice on where we retire. What's some advice that you would give military members that are coming up on transitioning out of service?
And I have to tell myself this quite often because I have friends that are transitioning at this moment that even worked with me at the White House, and they're nervous. We are the less than 1%. Of people who do the really difficult things for this country. And of that 1%, that strata that actually have done some of the things that many of your listeners have done, whatever discipline or occupation that they have, you're a subset of that 1%. That makes each one of those transitioning service members so powerful in that regard. You have to lean into that. You have to know that you're not just valuable, but you are probably one of the most highly trained individuals in whatever field that you're in at that moment. And that is profound. And a lot of the things that we've done in the military, whether we were officer or enlisted or warrant officer, the skills that we learn transcend everything you can possibly think of. The leadership that we've garnered over the years, the discipline, the accountability, the holding true to values that mean so much to so many people. It makes you an invaluable asset. And so while it may be scary, and it certainly was for me, realizing all of those things that I just mentioned is what gets you right into that interview, gets you right into that room, that board, wherever you're hoping to work for, or whoever you're hoping to work for or serve with. It makes you uniquely positioned to have done the things that you've done. When I think about myself, I've led on the battlefield in very unfavorable conditions, denied territories. How difficult can it be for me to be a board chair? Right. If I've done those things. And so once I realized that I've worked in situations that were very uncertain, with tasks that no one's been tasked with, protect the president of the United States from COVID-19.
In a time where there was very little information.
When the information was not ideal for us to be able to make sound decisions. But as a leader, just like anyone else on the battlefield, you take the information that you have confidence in your people, you have confidence in yourself, and you make calculated decisions while understanding the risk. All these things that we do as military members, I would argue no one else does better than us. And those cross-cutting transferable skills are unique to the military. So whatever trepidation that one may have about this transition, I think is something that you can have confidence in that you'll do just fine.
What do you say to someone that wants to do better, maybe wants to pursue, education or grow or develop themselves, but they're stuck with the but, right? But I can't do this because, and they view you maybe as like, you're the exception.
I would say that that's a natural feeling, to feel like you are the exception, until you remind yourself that you're not the exception, you're exceptional. And that's a conversation that you have to have with yourself. No one else is going to have that conversation with you as regularly and as often as you need to have it. That's a conversation that you have with yourself. I would say that's the belief system that I operate from. But I would also say that I surround myself with people that push me beyond my limits. If I'm the smartest person in the room, I'm in the wrong room. You know, if I'm the, you know, if I'm in a room where I have all the experience and all the knowledge, I'm in the wrong room. And so I put myself in situations in which I have access to people who've done things that I want to do, who can show me pathways that I can't see, who have influence that I don't have, who have resources that I haven't garnered. So I think those two things combined, finding good mentors that are willing to invest in you and hopefully see things in you that you can't see in yourself, combining that with that belief system of I'm not the exception, I'm exceptional, is what has been the formula for me.
So when did you decide to show up on LinkedIn? And what's the why behind it? You give so much to your audience and sharing those personal stories. Like, what does that mean to you?
For me, it's twofold. One is, I think, it's disarming for leaders who otherwise want to hide behind the mask of success. It's okay to say, I failed this and I failed that, and it's just empowering. Speaking of transition, I was just talking to one of my good friends at the White House, and he's like, you've had all these amazing job opportunities, and the next one seems better than the last one. And I said, listen, I've had 36 no's of jobs that I've applied for.
Right.
And he said, you know, wow, thank you for sharing that with me, because outwardly I would have never known. So on LinkedIn, what I aim to do was disarm leaders and people who are of influence and of import to be able to say, I struggle with these things. And Stephanie, you'd be surprised. I mean, some of the most profound and impactful people DM me, professors at Harvard. I mean, folks that are just wildly successful, and they share their stories with me personally, but they're oftentimes not quite ready to share their story for the world to see.
Right.
And I think that that's what I try to do, is disarm people in that regard. The other element of this is that I try to empower people who may see a resume, who may see a job history, and they say, I can never make it there.
Right.
It's impossible. When I share my story, then it humanizes the experience. It also enables other people to say that my perceived insurmountable obstacles that I have right now are just going to be a part of my testimony later on.
I don't know if you actually knew this. I'm former Army Medical Service Corps, joined as 70 Bravo. A lot of my peers at that time were thinking about, going to PA school, applying, and so I heard a lot of kind of their hopes, dreams, fears, all of that. Do most PAs come from the same background, or is it pretty diverse? Very
diverse.
Okay.
My class had Army Rangers, Special Forces medics, helicopter pilots, nurses, you name it. At least in the military setting, it is extremely diverse as far as background.
What qualities or attributes do you believe are most important for aspiring PAs to possess?
I think more than anything, empathy, and meeting people where they are. I've had great experiences in my profession, but I've also had terrible experiences. And I meet each one of those two diverging paths with the same level of empathy.
What advice would you give to someone who might be hesitant to to pursue a career as a physician assistant because they feel like they've got some limitations academically?
Bet on yourself. Bet on yourself. Because as we talked about earlier, I had none of the requirements when I submitted an application, which when I look back, I almost laugh at, like, who does that? Who submits an application for anything and say, I don't have any of the required experience or background. But that's a testament to betting on yourself and knowing that you can get to the mountaintop.
I love it. You absolutely have to have that faith in yourself. Man, this has been an amazing conversation. Bernard, we so appreciate you being here. Your story, so touching to so many.
Thank you for the opportunity. And, I'm honored to support and help in any way. Your audience, veterans, non-veterans. I think that me doing this is really a testament to the people who have done the same for me, to be accessible, and to be able to help people and to show them paths that maybe they can't quite see yet. And so in any way I can do that for you, for your audience, I'm honored to be able to do so.